It's a really good talk from James Stainer. Um, Stainer writes a lot on his blog, The Engineering Manager, and this year he published a book called Become an Effective Software Engineer Manager. Really good content, really good stuff. Please check that out. But today he's going to be sharing with us his learnings on the spectrum of synchronousness. And I love the title. It's totally relevant today because as we go back and forth between how we do comms, synchronous, asynchronous, how do we balance that out? Let's welcome James to kind of share a little bit more on that. James?
Hey, thank you so much for the introduction. Really kind of you. So let's get going. Cool music, huh? This is great. Like this conference is sweet. So we've got 30 minutes together today, and I'll be giving this talk, and then we'll do some Q&A afterwards. As mentioned, this is what I'm calling the spectrum of synchronousness. And fundamentally, what I want to do is seed your brains with lots of ideas about how to communicate the right way at the right time for the right reasons. And bottom left, that's my name. I'm James. Hello. And bottom right, I'm Senior Vice President of Engineering at a software as a service company called Brandwatch. And as all of you have probably experienced, this year has been a really weird one for how we communicate. We've had to relearn everything. So this is kind of a focusing together of all of my thoughts of everything that we've learned this year. And hopefully you can take away a whole bunch of things that you can implement immediately in your jobs. So here's what's coming up. Firstly, I need to convince you why you should even care about this talk. Why should I hold your attention for the next 30 minutes and not have you distracted? And I'm going to hopefully convince you that this is really important stuff. And then we're going to look at 2020. We all know what's happened, but we're going to focus in on what's changed before and after and the things that we can pick up from it. And then we're going to build this model that we're going to walk through together. And this model is going to be about synchronous communication and asynchronous communication, but then it's also going to touch upon things like permanence of the artifacts that we leave behind as we communicate. And then to borrow from a game called Dark Souls, which is the best video game ever, and I'll fight you, we're going to borrow humanity, and we're going to think about what it means to be human and how we build trust and rapport with each other while we communicate. And then we'll do some wrap-ups at the end. So let's get going. Why should you care? Why should you care about communication? After all, you're a very smart person. You're an excellent programmer. You're an excellent project manager, a brilliant QA. Surely communication is something that kind of comes second to all of those things. Well, I'm here to convince you that I think communication is one of the highest leverage things that you can do to become more effective in your job. Because fundamentally, communication underpins absolutely everything that's on the right-hand side. Programming, fundamentally, you write code for other human beings because the compiler takes care of the communication with the machine. Communication there is important. Also, it underpins the managerial relationships we have with our employees. Communication helps us be great leaders, whether that's technical or strategic or people leadership. Good communication helps us build consensus in our ideas. It helps us build rapport between each other so that we can work well together. And great communication means that good designs can be written that show the future that we're moving towards with our architecture. And even the architecture itself is an expression of our communication in how easy it is to understand and to build on top of. And there's feedback and more. What I'm saying is that if you can get better at communicating, then all of those things on the right get better as well. So it's well worth having a think about some of the tips and some of the models that we talk about today. So hopefully you're convinced that this is worth your time. 2020 happened. It's still happening. It's nearly over, fortunately. But we all know what happened in 2020. The main thing that happened is because of the pandemic, many of us have had to experience working remotely for the first time. And many of us, like myself, worked for companies that were very geographically central in terms of how they did their communication and their working together. I was very used to sitting next to the people that I work with. The teams that were collaborating with each other were just across the desks. But that's all changed, and it's changed for so many of us. Even the UK government, earlier on in the year, had to start taking their cabinet meetings online. And clearly they didn't know much about security because the screenshot that they released to the media still had the Zoom ID of the UK cabinet meeting, which you probably shouldn't broadcast, but oh well. But even these people who are used to these fancy meeting rooms and lots of in-person communication tried to replicate one-to-one the stuff that they were doing pre-pandemic to the stuff that they were doing during the pandemic. And that's a Zoom call with 35 people in it. And I can only imagine just how much of a pain that was as everyone was talking over each other, couldn't get a word in, there was no space. We've all been there, and it's very, very tiring. So we've tried to adapt what we did before to these new forms of communication, but fundamentally, none of us received any training. We spent so many years learning how to build software, so many years learning all the different things to make us effective, but have we really had any training to transition to this new distributed world? Not so much. I'm just as guilty of this as other people. In a previous situation, if I was having some issues with maybe my dev server or some kind of bug, I'd turn to the person next to me and I'd be like, oh, hey, can you just help me out with this thing? Instead, it's like, oh yeah, well, we use Slack for all of our communication now. That's just informal. So you end up posting a message in a chat room with 100 other people, and then no one replies because everyone else thinks that somebody else is going to reply, and the tumbleweed blows on. And that's because you have to choose the right format, is what I'm getting at here. Because there are so many formats, and it's so confusing. There are video calls, and then there are also emails. There's chat. There's the code that we write. There's these permanent wikis. We're producing recorded videos like Looms or trying to record meetings for distribution later. There are pull requests and all the things that we're doing in order to get our code deployed. There's so many formats with so many different forms of communication, and it's just a mess. I think that we need a model to think about the way in which we talk to each other. But before we look at the model, there's something that I think is really important that we have learned. And that is that if we treat everybody as remote, even if they aren't remote, then we yield a whole bunch of benefits that we didn't previously have. By treating everybody as remote, you get loads of really cool things happening. For example, have you ever had that experience before where you would be the only remote participant in a Zoom meeting, and you would dial in to see a very, very far away view of all of your colleagues sitting at a desk across the room and you can't hear them? If you treat everybody as remote, then you ensure that everyone has a webcam, everyone has a microphone, and that there's a level playing field there. If you treat everybody as remote, then you mindfully think about where other employees in the company might be. That in-person conversation that you have doesn't get lost in the ethers of time once you've had it. You think, oh yeah, I should probably write that up into our Slack channel so that other people can read it. So this mindset of treating everybody as remote will greatly help all of your communication. Just keeping it in mind is really, really beneficial. And if we apply this treating everybody as remote to this previous picture of the UK Parliament that we saw, if you have a look there, you can see that the cabinet room doesn't know what they're doing. The cabinet room, I think, is 4 people, but I can barely see them. There's 2 people really far away from that microphone. I mean, that must just be awful. Hopefully, in the more recent cabinet meetings, they've sorted that out. But in March, they were still struggling with this kind of thing. There's lots of things that you get by just adapting that mindset of everyone being remote. So we've cleared that off. Keep that in mind. It's really beneficial. Let's start walking towards this model that I've been talking about. There's one model, which basically is just an arrow at the bottom of the slides. It's not particularly complicated. But what we're going to do is plot the different ways in which we communicate on it with 3 different aspects. One of them is synchronousness. The other one is permanence, so our communication. And then the other is our humanity, or what it means to be human. So let's get going with synchronousness. Now, if you're an engineer, you probably know all about synchronousness. You know about sync and async and all that kind of good stuff in programming. And you can split it into 2. You've got synchronous and you've got asynchronous. No surprises there. And if you were a programmer, you'd be thinking, oh yes, synchronous is like the thread of execution in my JavaScript program. One statement is executing after the other. And then asynchronous is a bit like a promise. You know that something goes off into the browser to happen asynchronously, and you don't know when it comes back, but it will eventually reply, hopefully. So synchronous, in terms of communication, is communication that is existing or occurring at the same, and there are various vectors. It could be time, location, and format. And then conversely, in terms of asynchronous communication, it's not existing or occurring at the same time, location, and format. And it's very easy to think about some different examples that fall into these 2 buckets. However, I would say that in our model, we shouldn't treat them as just a binary, is it synchronous or is it asynchronous? It's more nuanced than that. What we can do is create this model that looks a little something like this. I promised you an arrow on a slide, and here's a slide with an arrow, so I'm fulfilling my promise to you. On the left-hand side, we have synchronous. On the right-hand side, we have asynchronous. Now, my own classification here may not agree with yours, but I would be happy to debate this out with you afterwards in the Q&A. The most synchronous form of communication is having a video call or a face-to-face communication. We need to be there at the same time, wherever we are around the world, communicating. And if we're face-to-face, we need to be in the same location, because if we're too far away, I simply will not be able to hear you. So synchronous is that one. And then we tend to go across to the right of the diagram. Now there's chat, which I categorized next as a little bit less synchronous, but still quite, because there's an expectation that comes from chat that if we're both online at the same time and we message each other, I'm probably going to expect a reply in a reasonable amount of time, assuming that you're not busy. And the same is true in reverse. Next up, you've got things like recorded videos. We might have a meeting, someone's not present, we'll record the video and then we'll distribute it later. That's not as synchronous as chat, because usually it will take people time to watch it and catch up, but the information will be fairly sort of relevant to a particular day or time, and it will fade over time. Then there's written documents. We all write things, we all circulate them. If I spend a whole bunch of time writing 3 or 4 pages of text, I'm expecting that probably over the course of a number of days, maybe a week, you'll eventually read it and catch up, and then we'll continue the conversation from there. And there's email. Now, this is highly debated. I would say I'm fairly synchronous with my email, but that's me. Most people aren't. Email carries an expectation that you can kind of get to it when you're ready. There are some people who answer quickly. There are some people who take weeks to answer their email. Everyone's different, but I'd put it there. There's an expectation that someone might not get back to you immediately. And then on the fully asynchronous side, you've got permanent documentation, things like wikis, readmes, and so on, that you write it and then you expect that someone might read it today, tomorrow, next month, next year. It's fairly evergreen. So not only is there nuances in all the different ways in which we communicate, the key thing is that the format that you choose to communicate carries an expectation, and that expectation is implicit, but your explicit choice sets the expectation. So in that example that I said of the tumbleweed, of me shouting out into that 100-person channel that I need some help, to be honest, it was probably my fault that I didn't get any help, because I would be more effective if I found somebody who I thought would be able to help me and said, hey, can we jump on a video call for 5 minutes so you can just help me with this bug? That would be a much better choice for me to take, because the expectations of having a video call would be that someone was able to stop for a minute, help me out, unblock me, and then I can move on. So you have to pick the format that you want to use in terms of your expectations for the communication, and also the synchronousness and the asynchronousness that you're aiming for. There are also techniques you can use to blur things on that sync and async line. This is a really, really good tip that I think you could find really useful. So these are called silent meetings. So what these are meant to remedy is a situation that you've probably had, which is that you've got a really great idea, you spend a really long period of time writing it all up as a lovely document, you spend ages on the diagrams, it looks great, and then you set a meeting next week and say, hey, I'd love to talk to you about this thing. Here's the document. If we all go and read it before the meeting, then we can go to the meeting and have a chat about it. Sounds like a really good idea. Good use of asynchronous communication, and then a synchronous match-up point at the end. However, what inevitably happens is you get to the meeting, 2 people have read it, 5 people haven't had the time. Oh dear, what a waste of time. So there's this concept called the silent meeting, where what you do is you still produce the document, you still have the meeting. However, you carve out a bunch of time at the start of the meeting, say 20 or 25 minutes, where you all sit there in silence, synchronously, reading the document. And then when you're all finished, you then begin to talk from exactly the same point at the idea being developed, because you've all actually read it. And there's a link there, and I can summarize these all on Hopin afterwards so you can click them, to the Silent Meeting Manifesto, which just gives you some hints and tips of how to implement this. But this has saved us a hell of a lot of time at work. And this is really interesting, because if you think about synchronous and asynchronous communication, you start to think of parallels in, say, distributed systems, where there's strong and eventual consistency. Because synchronous communication is like strong consistency. If you think about distributed systems that have tricky pinch points, maybe around Apache Zookeeper, where you need to have strong consistency between all the nodes. And in order to get the information broadcast amongst the whole distributed system, the world needs to stop so that all the information can be broadcasted and then it can start again. That's the problem with synchronous communication. The more nodes that you have, the harder it is to ensure that consistency, because it just takes so much effort. Whereas asynchronous is like eventual consistency, where you could have a very big distributed system and it's built in such a way that not every node needs the latest information, but it can get what it needs when it needs it. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And you can also think about number of nodes in a distributed system as to how you can move at different speeds. If you need high synchronousness and high speed, then you're probably best off with a closed small group. If you want everyone to know what's going on, then you need to think about broadcast, but it's going to be low synchronousness and low speed because of that eventual consistency. So we've looked at this synchronous to asynchronous mapping, and we've plotted all these different forms of communication on it. And I think that the first thing you can do is consider this, think about the choice of what you're going to use, consider the expectations that it carries by doing so, and then you can have more effective communication as a result. Great, that's the first bit covered off. Next up, we're going to talk about permanence. Nothing is permanent in life, but some communication is. And there's always that design document from 5 years ago that throws you off. But when it comes to permanent and impermanent communication, we could do the same thing. We can bucket it into these two definitions. Unsurprisingly, permanence is about something not changing. It's the state or quality of lasting or remaining unchanged indefinitely. But in terms of communication, we're not just talking about a document sitting around in Google Drive forever. We're also talking about the content, because the relevance of something that you have stored will change over time. The accuracy will change over time, and fundamentally the usefulness will change. And on the flip side, impermanence, something may only last for a limited period of time, a conversation face-to-face. And the relevance and the accuracy and the usefulness is completely defined by how long it is around for. And there's an interesting correlation. If we take the model that we just looked at, we can see that there is a strong correlation between synchronous communication and impermanence. And there's a strong correlation between asynchronous communication and permanence, because in order to perform good asynchronous communication, we need to produce artifacts, documents, things that we send around. So depending on where we pick on this scale, we are producing or not producing some amount of information that we can read later. Something else that also folds into this is that pre-pandemic, especially if we work for companies that had a strong in-person communication element, we would probably find ourselves over there quite a lot of the time, in that grey section on the left-hand side. Lots of our work was being done by impromptu chats, maybe using Slack, things that didn't really generate a lot of documentation. And perhaps maybe you, as well as I, and definitely I did, found that when we all went remote as the pandemic began, we all started wondering, where's that documentation that says how I run this? And does anyone have a link to how I do this thing? And is there a diagram of this architecture anywhere? Where is that? Does anyone have this? And then you suddenly realize that no, we've all just been using each other's working memory and then accessing it in person all the time. So I could argue that we've been doing too much stuff on the left there with time and too little stuff on the right. And this not only has produced not enough documentation during the pandemic, I think our ability to really do good written documents and really good emails and really good documentation has suffered as a result, because we've not practiced it as much. So the little tip I'd say keeping in mind here is it always is going to take your energy to communicate. It takes your energy to have a conversation, to draw something on a whiteboard. But what you should do is think of the future and think about whether you're making it better, because you have to expend that energy anyway. So if you pick the right format and you put the right amount of effort into it, then you could actually give your future self a whole bunch of gifts that just give again and again and again, because it makes everything more efficient. Now, there are other companies out there that are doing this really well. This is one that comes to mind especially, and this is Gitlab's Handbook. So Gitlab are a remote company, and they have been pretty much since the beginning. And one thing that they've done as part of their culture is they've produced their handbook, which is pretty much documentation on how you do absolutely everything at Gitlab, which is fantastic if you're onboarding, because it's all right there. And they've got everything from their OKRs, and you can see, and this is all public as well, which is quite interesting. I don't work there, but I can see it. I can see what their OKRs are planned for next year. I can see how they're getting on to thinking about IPOing. I can even go and find out how I need to raise a ticket in the finance system if I wanted to, even if I don't work there. And this may seem like overkill because you're really looking at 10 years worth of documentation that they've generated, but they've clearly been thinking about the future as they've been producing this, because that knowledge just collects and collects and collects, and it's part of their job to keep it up to date. Therefore, anyone can find out anything that they need to at any given time. And you can go and have a look at this yourself. It's about.gitlab.com/handbook, and it's a really excellent tool. So because plagiarism is the best form of compliment, at Brandwatch this summer, we started to write our own engineering handbook. So this is a screenshot. Nowhere near as comprehensive as the GitLab handbook, but we're trying our best. And we've tried to collate together all the documentation that we've produced over the last few years that we thought would be useful to new people if they were joining. So we took the lens of, I am new to the company, what do I need to know? And this is where we have all of our onboarding documentation. We have our org chart, our divisions, what we're working on, our products, and so on. But the idea is that we try and now keep this up to date all the time so that people know where to look when they need to find out useful stuff. It doesn't necessarily all have to be gifts to the future at a department level either. There's stuff that you can do in your team starting today, which can be really useful. So these are called architecture decision records, and you can check them out at adr.github.io. It sounds like a really fancy thing, but really it's just a template of some text that you fill in. And the idea is that often when you look at a mature code base, it's designed in a certain way, and you just go, why on earth is it written this way? This is really strange. It's meant to get over that by whenever you go through a point in time where you have to make an architectural change to your code base, you create one of these architecture decision records where you write the problems that you're facing, the context, what some of the options are that you considered for how you're going to move forward, and then you check it into your code base just in a folder, like a folder called ADR, for example. And then it creates a lasting record, a gift to your future, showing it what you were thinking at this point in time and why the code base evolved in that way. And some of our teams are using these to great effect in order to capture what we were thinking at the time and diagram ideas. And you can also pull request it in so you can have a chance to review each other's architecture decision records as well. So that's a great way of taking some possibly impermanent communication before and turning it into something permanent and useful in the future. And then a last example is design docs. Fortunately, we've done design docs for a long time, probably not as well as Google, but this particular blog post at industrialempathy.com gives a really, really good walkthrough of how to write great design docs. And design docs are just fantastic because they encourage consensus to be built. They allow people to contribute to things that are happening in other teams by reviewing their designs, understanding what they're doing, and offering their suggestions. And what's good as well is that if you archive your design docs forever, then you also get these wonderful snapshots of what you were thinking last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, as you were building out your features and building out your systems. And there's always stuff to learn from looking at the past. So permanence strongly correlates with synchronous and asynchronous communication. The more asynchronous you are, the more gifts to the future that you give yourself. However, you do need to think about how good those gifts are and make sure that they're relevant and that they're concise and that you write them well. But those resources that I just showed you hopefully should allow you to create them much, much better. And I would say that we spend too much time over here. And that's probably okay, but we should think about how we can shift to the right in this diagram and produce more that we can learn from in the future. Too much, too little, but we can change that. So the last part of the model is humanity. And I use the word humanity because there's a video game called Dark Souls, which is absolutely brilliant. It's the best video game ever. And you play a knight who is in this strange purgatory world, wakes up there, full of monsters, full of weird things, and you are human. And it's a very hard game. You die all the time. You go around the corner, you die. You try it again, you die. You die, you die. And every time you die, you lose your humanity. You turn into a zombie, a hollow zombie, and you restore your humanity by sitting around one of these bonfires. And if you've been on Zoom calls for 8 hours in one day, you know what it's like to be a hollow zombie, because the way in which we communicate can really take it out of us. But I think you can also map our humanity and our connection, our feeling of being part of the human race, even if we are remote, on this. If you do video calls, if you do chat, if you watch recorded videos, you get to see other humans, you get to feel other humans, you get to experience the emotion of there being another person at the other end of the line. However, if you are doing lots of asynchronous communication like emails and documents and wikis, you're only ever really interacting with text. So actually, this starts to go completely in the opposite direction of everything I've suggested so far, which is that, yes, we should go to the right. We should do more documentation. We should be more asynchronous. We should treat everyone as remote. But unfortunately, if we go too far like that, too much of the time, then we begin to feel like we're not connected to other people. And that's something that definitely employees that we've had have suffered this year, especially people that live on their own, people that haven't got their family close by. They've just felt like too much asynchronous communication has just made them feel isolated. So the question you have to ask here is, are you restoring your humanity when you're talking to other people, or are you going hollow? So what you need to do is basically break the rules on purpose, and you need to be inefficient sometimes in order to feel connected. You need to be able to goof off at work, even if you're in a remote situation. And this is a screenshot of our Brandwatch Slack communities. And yes, there is a Britney Spears community. I'm not part of that one. There's things like Warhammer painting, there's gaming, there's all sorts of sports, there's all sorts of interests. And we have this all part of our onboarding documentation because it's really important that as part of the workday, on work time, people are also taking part in fun conversations with other people about all sorts of things, because we are humans and we need to be connected to each other. And these are the kinds of things that would happen in the kitchen if we were in the office, because you go and have a chat while you made a coffee. People play board games at lunchtime, and we've lost all of that. So we have to somehow emulate this in a more asynchronous world. Additionally, when it is safe to do so and to go outside and meet up in person, encourage people to block out time in their calendar during the workday, not in the evenings, not in the morning, not at lunchtime, during the workday, to meet up with their colleagues with no agenda, just to hang out, to connect, and just to be around other humans. And fundamentally, everything that I've said so far, you should also disregard at points in time. You should break the rules for fun. Sometimes it's actually super fun to use completely the wrong format on purpose. Having a chaotic Zoom meeting with 40 people may just be ridiculous, but the kind of craziness and the hilarity of all of it can just help you feel like you've seen other people, that you're a part of something bigger than just yourself and your laptop, and that there are others out there. And doing all these things on purpose fundamentally restores that humanity and that warmth that you have as you're walking around this strange world at the moment. So we're getting at the end. I'll just wrap the talk up. So hopefully I convinced you at the start why you should care about the talk. That communication, even if you're an engineer, the most genius engineer in the world, working on your communication skills really does add a huge amount of leverage to what you do and makes you more effective. We touched upon what happened in 2020 and how we all ended up in a communication situation that we probably never had any formal training about, how we had to really adapt without training and find our feet in a new world. And then we thought of this spectrum. It was an arrow on a slide, not the fanciest diagram ever. However, we plotted the different ways in which we could talk to each other, and we considered synchronousness from sync to async. We considered permanence and leaving gifts to ourselves in the future. And we also considered humanity and what it means to be human and connected to other people. And now, right at the end of the talk, there we are on the last bullet point. So all that's left is to say thank you very much. If you want to talk to me, I'll be doing Q&A. Also, I'm on Twitter at STANIER. I do have a book, as mentioned. You can go to theengineeringmanager.com/book. For the time period, I think for maybe the next week, you can get 40% off if you buy it through the publisher. DRM-free ebook. Use the code TurkeySale2020. I didn't come up with that code myself. It's Thanksgiving related, but it's all there for you. So thank you very much for listening, and I appreciate your time very much.
All right. Thank you, James. Oh my God, so much goodness there. And Turkey Sale 2020, still valid for me too. I'll take it. So let's talk about the Queen. I mean, no, not the Queen. Okay, let's talk about your talk, and let's go into a little bit of the details. We have a couple of questions here. I'll get started with Balazs. He says, I remember the time when I returned from a week-long holiday to the office, and there were 700 or 800 unread emails. Now the vast majority of the written communication happens via chat. Which directions do you think written communication will evolve?
That's really interesting. There's a few things that came to mind as you were saying that. There was a rumor, and this is going slightly off topic, but there was a rumor that one of the upcoming features in Slack would be an Instagram stories style thing, so that each channel, people could keep recording their little up. This is just overwhelming. And the same is true now that people are recording more videos. You come back to work and it's like, oh yeah, all those 40 hours of meetings that you missed, well, all the video files are there, so you can watch them. And you're like, where am I going to find the time? This is ridiculous. Like, surely if you're off work, you're off work. So personally, I would encourage kind of some way of people flagging like what is a critical thing to catch up on versus optional. And then you can just ignore the optional. I mean, I've often seen, when I was doing my PhD, there was a lecturer who would go on holiday and just the out-of-office reply would be, anything you send me is just getting deleted. So I'll be back on this day. If you really need me still, come and get me. So there are ways to tackle it, but I agree. Like, we are producing so much documentation and more videos, more reading, and I think just understanding what's critical and what's not, and then just ignoring it is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Otherwise, you just have to catch up the hours that you're off work, and you just never get a chance to escape, right?
And you only have so many hours and so many people creating so much content, right? It's like an overwhelming amount of time that you won't be able to get back, even if it's like double or 3 times speed. You know, sometimes you cheat, right? And you want to just get through it all.
Yeah, you end up with the 3 times speed video, and then you're reading the email, and then you've got Slack, and you're not taking anything in. It's
exactly.
Just,
So I like the concept. There's almost something there around just creating a digest, or just like getting people to create the content. What is the most important thing that I should get to, right? And then have that as a focus.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So, and what are your predictions for the next 5 to 10 years in that? Like, where do you think it's going? You mentioned the Instagram stuff, these kind of stuff. Where do you think, realistically, you think might happen in this space?
I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I think more broadly, I think that the hybrid model of working will not go away, and I think more of us will have the option to be remote. But I think what's important is that it really isn't for everybody. There are people that are suffering right now because they cannot be with people. And any prediction of, oh, it's all right, we'll all be remote in the future, therefore fine. No. But I think one of the things we've seen recently with, I don't use it myself, but the Hey email system that the Basecamp people came out with, a focus on trying to just tame the complexity. Because, as you say, the pandemic period has produced a glut of content in the way that we work with each other, too much. So I think software and tools that allow us to really focus in and get on the critical information are probably what might be a good idea.
Nice. And we have another question here from Julia. 1 second. How do you ensure discoverability? I really like written docs, but one pushback I keep getting is that it's unfindable. You know, it's basically lost. How do you address that? What are your ideas here?
I wonder if you're using Google Drive, because if you are, I find the same problem. You put things in folders and they vanish, and I understand completely. I mean, what we've tried to do, which isn't perfect by any means, is that if you take the most permanent forms like wikis and readmes, you know that they never change in terms of their location. So using those almost as index pages to point to things that do get lost quite easily. So that slide that I showed you with our engineering handbook, quite a lot of the links are not necessarily other wiki pages. They will link off to a Google Sheet or a Google Doc, which otherwise would have been lost because, I mean, I think we've probably all done the same thing, which is like, oh yes, that document, it was called, and then you search for a word, and then you know what I mean. It's impossible. So yeah, we kind of create lots of index pages which link off, but then people have to take care of them, which again is another problem.
Yeah, got it. And I think it's a good best practice, right? There's a little bit of like investment in your doc, but there's also a little bit of investment needed to be done to organize that content, so it's highly discoverable and like easily to get to. So I got another question here. What are good software tools to run remote culture? What do you recommend here?
I can't say I'm an expert, but things that have worked pretty well. Slack is good. I'm sure Teams is good also. Some kind of chat platform works well. If anything, just because before Slack happened, before Microsoft Teams happened, every team had their own chat platform. They were using Skype chat or XChat or IRC or something. And at least consolidating that into one place is good. So Discord, Slack, Teams, whatever is a good backbone to organize informal things. I still really love email because I think it's archival, and anything I think is important should be an email because it's kept forever, and you can sort of go back and see decisions that were made. Some good wiki software is good. In engineering, at least, we use Confluence. I'm not the hugest fan of Confluence, but it does the job, and it also sort of integrates with Jira. And other things, if you're a smaller company, I think Basecamp is excellent. I use Basecamp for home, so I've got a little Basecamp project for me and my partner, and we have all of the house schedule, when do the bins go out, kind of in there. So that's good for a small operation, but I think it's quite hard using Basecamp at scale. So those are the ones that I like, but your mileage may vary. And I think I've found the less we've had to worry about hosting stuff ourselves, the better, because if you have to put as much effort into managing all of your software, then it just takes time away from doing the actual job as well.
Thank you for sharing. So we have a question from Joel. So speaking of emulating office behavior in a remote environment, have you tried some kind of remote presence solution? If so, any difficulties implementing it? So
not recently. We are a medium-sized company, so the amount of money we have to spend on fancy things is not huge. My friend in real life works at a bank, and they have some very complex remote presence set up. You go into this very fancy meeting room, and it's like half a table that goes into a projector screen, and you sit around the table, and then it projects the other people on the other side of the table. I mean, that's amazing, but I haven't got that kind of budget. Some other fun things we've tried in the past is you can get those telepresence robots that are kind of like an iPad on they were kind of fun, but they weren't super reliable, and they were just a bit weird, to be honest. I always remember someone driving it outside of the range of the Wi-Fi, and then it ended up sort of stuck outside the building, and no one could control it. And but we haven't put too much effort in. But I think, for me at least, the remote tools are okay. And then as soon as we're able to meet up more, then just being able to meet up once a quarter, half a year, if you can get everyone in the same location, is super beneficial, because you find that those kind of small frustrations and differences in communication styles that become personal vendettas against particular people over time, you kind of meet up in person and it all just goes away because they're just another human.
Got it. Yeah, I also would like to see those in action just to kind of experience it myself. But yeah, it's still not there for me, like how to connect these together. So another question here around the other regular issue with written docs is they tend to get outdated very often. And how do you prevent that? How do you incorporate that into your process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Being quite brutal with deleting them is good. Anything that as soon as it's not relevant, you delete it, or you can come up with some kind of way of marking things as this is stale or this is outdated, if you want to keep it around. But I guess the problem is the more you keep around, the easier it is to find old stuff and probably harder to find new stuff. One other thing that you can do is that if you're producing any kind of documentation about Teams or the code base or anything, in the same way that you would have Teams own particular parts of the code base or the infrastructure, you can say you also own this documentation as well. And it's like part of your responsibility to make sure that this is all up to date, and you're kind of expected to. And having that sort of ownership of that documentation explicit, I think helps it just evolve, because people don't want to be responsible for out-of-date stuff.
Very nice. Yeah, and that pruning is cleaning that up is super important, right? Because that just adds to the massive confusion, right? And then people get frustrated and then kind of lose the hope of the written communication. So that is very major. Changing it up a bit on just getting people to do asynchronous communication. So do you find convincing non-tech people to do async harder? Are there good tricks for people who are non-technical people to do asynchronous communication?
I mean, I don't have any explicit tips. I mean, it's just come through practice. I think that's the main thing, is just setting an expectation that you will be doing it, and then everyone supporting each other as you go along a journey of trying. Because one thing just sort of related that we noticed is that a number of people that work for me really do find writing hard. You know, they are the most amazing presenters. They talk to you and they're like incredibly convincing and they've got great ideas and you're like, wow, that's great, I understand. But either just through inexperience or maybe they have dyslexia or other things that affect their writing, they just find it so hard to get their meaning across in asynchronous forms and just stay on top of everything. So personally, I don't know of any really good training programs, but I've been working with some of my staff directly to make their written communication better. But there is this one fantastic YouTube video, which I'll share on Hopin afterwards, which is this motivation as to how to become a better writer from a University of Chicago course. It did the rounds on Twitter a few weeks ago, but it's well worth watching because it talks about like how and why to be convincing and how you write and communicate. And it's just really entertaining. I didn't think I'd watch it, and then I ended up sort of looking at it on my phone. And I'd run myself a bath in the evening, and then an hour later, I was like, "Oh my god, I've forgotten that I was running the." Yeah, I'll share that around. It's a really, really great talk.
Nice. I'll look forward to it. I think, yeah, building that writing muscle is that first thing, right? Just getting into the habit of it is just so key to start building that asynchronous communication across the organization. So yeah, I'll look forward to that YouTube video as well. So the silent meeting manifesto, I really like that. It also kind of goes into the drive-by meeting, right, where you kind of get a bunch of content, put it in front of somebody, like react, right? so I really like this concept, and there's a question around the silent meeting sounds interesting. However, I would expect a huge resistance pushback from engineers because they can feel like it's waste of time. Do you have any suggestions on how to motivate people for attending a silent meeting?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? I think something that we've talked about a lot here is even though it can be really hard to convince people that something's worth their time, there's so many kind of efficiency gains. And like certainly as an engineer myself, like I really like the idea of not repeating myself, being efficient, optimizing what I do, being able to get more time to be effective. And I think things like silent meetings, things like spending more time reading and writing more, even though they might seem like it distracts you from your primary means of output, if you think about the bigger picture of like what it means for us all to share ideas, build consensus, understand where we're going, all of that pays back dividends in the future. So I think you just really have to appeal to everyone's sense of like efficiency, their sense of wanting to increase their output, not repeat themselves, be better. And just try it out. You know, maybe you could experiment. Say, we're going to try this once, and then we'll get some feedback on what you think. But let's just give it a go. And then usually people do it, and they're like, "Wow, we had this meeting, and like we actually finished on time, and no one misunderstood." And yeah, you just give it a go.
I'm going to actually do this with my own teams. As James mentioned, we do have a little bit more time with him in the Q&A sessions, so you can check that out in the sessions tab after we kind of close off the stage. James, we will send you a little keepsake from Craft with your
awesome
little mug. So
look at that! That's amazing.
Mug with your nice portrait here.
That's brilliant.
So we'll get that to you over post. Thank you again for joining us here, James, and sharing a really good talk in a really timely manner. We need to level up our gaming comms and keep the humanity, right? I really love how you ended it. I think that is the most important part here. We got to get human, goof it up, live it, have some fun.